Hello everybody, my name is Linda Johnston. I'm the Dean of the Lawrence S. Bloomberg Faculty of Nursing at the University of Toronto. I'm happy to welcome you all to the September session of the 2020-2021 Lunch and Learn series. Before we begin, I'm just going to cover a couple of housekeeping items. Today's session will begin with a presentation from our speaker, and we'll have the opportunity for between 15 and 20 minutes of Q&A at the end. You'll be muted throughout the presentation in order to prevent background noise. Shelley is going to provide polls and opportunities for questions to be addressed throughout the presentation, as well as after the presentation. To submit a question, you can use the question and answer chat function on your screen. Once you have finished typing your question, please don't forget to hit send. Alternatively, if you would like to discuss something with the presenter, please press the raised hand button or write, "I have a comment question" in the chat. I'll state your name and CASN staff Julie Thomas will unmute you so you can ask your question. I would ask that if your question is asked by another participant, that you remember to press the lower hand button so that we can get through as many unique questions as possible. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the concept of the Lunch and Learn, where faculty members come together during their lunch hour to share with one another projects they are working on and to dialogue and discuss methodologies, successes, and challenges they've encountered in their work. This webinar series is intended to serve as an inspiration and a networking opportunity for participants while recreating the collegial feel of the Lunch and Learn. In this first session of the 2020-2021 series, we will hear from Dr. Shelley Cobbett. Dr. Cobbett has been an RN for over 36 years and has taught at the post-secondary level for just over 30 years. She is currently the Dalhousie University School of Nursing Site Administrator at the Yarmouth campus and chair of the curriculum group that has developed, implemented and evaluated a new BSCN curriculum that started in 2016. Her doctoral work was completed in 2006 and was centered around web-based learning and professional socialization in the online environment. Shelley began teaching fully online nursing courses over 15 years ago, and during normal times, face-to-face and hybrid courses as well. Her program of research centers around the scholarship of teaching and learning, with a particular focus related to the online learning environment, including virtual simulation. With a lightning-fast mandated change from face-to-face in-person classes to web-based courses globally because of the COVID-19 pandemic, educators are seeking best practices related to online learning and teaching. Many faculty are examining how to best merge cognition and technology to offer students quality, relevant online courses. Creating and fostering learning communities and social presence in the online environment is of specific importance to engage students in meaningful interactions about and with the course content. Students examine and discuss various points of view to stimulate critical thinking and clinical judgment. During today's webinar, titled Enhancing Online Engagement with Challenge-Based Learning Cycles, Shelley will present an adapted version of the Challenge-Based Learning CBL method and its utility in an online emergency preparedness and disaster planning course. CBL Cycles are learner-centered and maximize the use of learner-generated content, thus enhancing the value of active participation and engagement, which is at the very core of successful online education. Student and faculty perspectives related to the CBL method of learning will be discussed, and lessons learned from the use of this adapted teaching pedagogy within the online environment will be shared. I'll now turn the session over to Shelley so we can begin. Shelley?
Thank you so much, Linda. Welcome everyone to this session today, and I'm excited to share with you my experience with using challenge-based learning cycles. And we'll start first by just looking at what the session is, what I plan to cover, hopefully what we plan to learn together, and then we'll go through some slides. I will be stopping my video because you will note that one of the best practices that has emerged in the literature as well as from students is that they find it difficult to read a slide, to listen to the voice, and also look at different videos on the screen and we'll talk about cognitive load in a little bit, but that certainly increases the cognitive load. So I just wanted to say hi, good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you are in Canada, and thanks for joining us. The goals of the session today are to introduce to you Gardner's 5 minds, or reintroduce to you if you're aware of that information, and how I use those 5 minds to try to nurture those in the students and try to pull away from this content is important to how can we nurture a well-learning experience. And I have found that Bransford's challenge-based learning to be very, very helpful. I've used it in the face-to-face context as well as in the online context. And where it's contextually grounded in the online environment, it works really well. When I first started experimenting with this, I did contact Mr. Bransford and asked if he would let me adapt his methods so that it would really fit the nursing context. So I want to share that with you. I also want to give you a little glimpse into what a CBL looks like from a student perspective, and it's really focused on a discovery-based learning. So we'll talk a bit about that, as well as cognitive load, and then reflecting upon what online strategies will cultivate the 5 minds as we outline them. Please, during the presentation at any point, if you'd like to stop and ask a question, or if you have a comment, you can do so. Julia will be monitoring the chat as well as the hand raise function, and I welcome discussion as we move throughout. You need not wait till the end. So right now, Julia has a quick poll. However, with minimal attendees, we're going to try to launch it just to ensure it works. Julia, could you do the first poll for attendees, please?
Sure, happy to.
So Julia, the message is saying the hosts and panelists aren't able to vote.
Oh, okay.
So we can always go to plan B, and that's one very important guiding principle when you're teaching online. You always need a second plan or a backup plan. And our backup plan was just to get folks to raise their hands if they do teach undergraduate nursing.
So we have 3 out of 3 votes.
Perfect, thank you. Thanks, everyone. And as you see, the results of the poll will come up, and this is unlimited in number. I find polling throughout a teaching session or an encounter online really engages students, whether it engages them or makes them stay tuned in. The main reason is that they're there and they're participating. What is good online education? My first reaction when I was asked to talk about good line education was to say, well, it's the exact same as good face-to-face education. You know, what we forget is that physical proximity is not a precondition for good education. So it's all of the same principles. It's how we merge the technology and the cognition in the online environment is our challenge. So first of all, and I don't think any of these will be new to any educators, social presence is important. And that's pertaining to how instructors and learners actually see each other as real people in the environment, whether it's in the classroom or online. Simply sharing attributes or characteristics or things that have happened through a discussion and dialogue increases that social presence. It's really important for online learners, however, because it combats those feelings that students often say of feeling isolated, and it gives learners a feeling of community. Social presence can be positively linked with learning outcomes and student satisfaction, and that has been indicated in the research. There was also some research that looked at the actual participation discussion of students, and that study showed that students produced higher quality discussion posts, and higher quality was measured by length as well as reading level and critical analysis when they were doing so in small groups rather than large groups online. We situate social presence as our perception of interpersonal relationships that we create, and that can be done in the online environment as well as face-to-face. Interestingly, when I started online, I had a hunch that I was starting to know my online students as well as, if not more than my face-to-face students, even though at times we had up to 80 or 90 students in our online classes. So I took one of the activities I did online, which was an introduction that I asked students to tell us one thing that they don't think anybody in the class knows about them and that they're comfortable sharing. I moved that to my face-to-face course, which at the time was a 4th year course. So those students, that cohort of students had been together almost 4 years. And it was absolutely amazing to see the number of students in the class that had similar interests, that did not know they had similar interests, even after spending 4 years together. So that for me really cemented the social presence online. When students can connect with their peers and their faculty in a learning environment, whether it's a classroom, lab, clinical, or online, they perceive that social presence, they feel it, and then they contribute more to that learning community. I think interaction too is very important. Once again, whether it's online or face-to-face, courses have to be much more than placeholders for students to access information. You would not walk into a classroom and put up a PowerPoint and go through it without any interaction or dialogue. Same as online. A good course provides the information, but it also involves the interactions with a focus on interactions, not only between the professor and the student, but between students and students. So with the professor and student, we can involve students receiving personalized feedback, for example, guidance. One of the changes I've made over the last couple of years providing feedback to my online students is I change it up. I may do a text feedback one time, an audio feedback another time, or a quick video clip the other time. Once again, variety. A good course, whether it's online or not, once again, is a social learning environment, and we're trying to provide opportunities to develop that vibrant learning community, which students will then take to other online courses. We know we are in unprecedented times. Students don't normally have all or the majority of their courses online. So students as well as faculty are engaging a lot with their screens. So we need to make it engaging and challenging. A good course has engagement and does challenge students. We want to invite students to participate. We want to motivate them to contribute. We want them to be excited about what they're learning about. So really capitalizing on that joy of learning. We want to challenge students with skills to enhance their skills, abilities, and knowledge. So keep in mind, a good online course is not a content dump, but a challenge. The course promotes student agency, I think, is very important. And by student agency, I mean allowing students to learn through activities that are meaningful and relevant to learners. And that's driven by their interests, their backgrounds, sometimes self-initiated, but once again, appropriate guidance from teachers. We cannot expect beginning students and beginning practitioners to be able to pick out the salient part of a chapter, for example. If we give 60 pages of reading, we have to provide some direction to help them critically think about the material and figure out what's salient. We would do this in the classroom, so it's important to do that and extend that into the online classroom. And it can take many forms in that classroom. I've heard many exciting success sources from the last semester online with faculty doing very creative things online, a lot of gaming, a lot of virtual simulations, some escape room challenges, all getting students to come together in groups, work as a team, and create that learning environment. And creativity. I mean, I don't think nurses are any more creative than they've always been. We've certainly seen creativity rise over the last 3 or 4 months as we once again flipped on a dime to change. I was saying before we started the presentation, there's something that's given in my life every day now, and that is something is going to change, and we need to be ready for that change. I'll just pause for a second and see if there are any comments or questions. I think the important takeaway from this slide is that good online education equates to good face-to-face education. What makes a course good, regardless of physical proximity or platform, are the key components of good courses.
I don't see any questions in the chat or the Q&A, Shelley.
Okay, great. Thank you, Linda. So we'll move on to cognitive load, and a real caution here to watch the cognitive load. Cognitive load theory is controversial. There are proponents and opponents, which there are with almost every theory, but when we're talking about online learning and screen time, I think we need to give some attention to cognitive load. And by this, I mean, have you taken 1 week of your online learning and actually gone through it as a student would? And I think that's important. At times, we want to make sure we have all that's necessary to know. We love to put in nice to know things. We often might do some enrichment activities too, but we need to be cognizant of that cognitive load, especially knowing the student at this point in time may be taking 4 or 5 courses online. So what do I mean by a cognitive load? Really, at a basic level, it's the situation where the faculty person gives too much information or too many tasks to learners simultaneously. And this results in the learner not being able to process any information or very little information. Cognitive load theory postulates that there are 3 types of load that exist in virtually every learning environment. And these loads will affect a person's use of their working memory and ultimately of their recall ability from long-term memory. And this has always been our goal in nursing education, to move to understanding and recall ability through understanding rather than memorization. So just very quickly, there are 3 types. Intrinsic is the complexity of the material being presented, and the intrinsic load differs among all students and all faculty. It's dependent upon prior knowledge. The more prerequisite knowledge you have going into a class or a learning experience, the lower the cognitive load would be to you. And this really speaks to the quality of learning activities, readings prior to class. If a student starts learning prior to class, doing their readings, and then the whole class, be it online or face-to-face, is just a regurgitation of the reading, students soon learn that it's not important to come to the class prepared or come to the class with some prior knowledge. And this is what we have to avoid. And certainly with the movement to active learning, this has certainly helped us maximize that intrinsic load so that it is minimized when they actually come to the learning encounter. Extraneous load, that's a lot that we cannot handle or minimize within our courses. It adds nothing to the learning experience. However, there are a few things that we can do. For example, animations or graphics that aren't relevant to what we're talking about should be avoided, because that cognitive load is increased each time that happens. So if you look at this slide, you have a higher cognitive load because the scale is balanced there than if the words were there and you were just listening to my voice. I know that sounds small, but when you look at it and you, for example, have 6 to 8 of these extraneous graphics that not only students tell us take time to download, especially in rural areas, but adding to that extraneous load, it's something to keep in mind when designing your classes online. And the 3rd type of load is germane, and these are the things that assist the student in using their working memory effectively for learning. So we want a really, really high germane load. And what I mean by that is we want students to be engaged. These are activities that facilitate their learning, like taking notes, making memory hooks, teaching the learned content to appear, small group activities. When we have a high germane load within our student population, the students are engaged and they have more mental resources to actually learn. So it's a balance we need to achieve. We need to try to ensure our best that our intrinsic loads aren't exceeded when we develop our courses. The extraneous loads too, we try to minimize, because we don't want to consume all of that cognitive working memory, because we want students to enable them to direct what resources they have to learning processes online. Oftentimes we find that if we have a slide up and we're repeating what's on the slide, that's double learning. Certainly repetitive learning is positive. However, it should happen sequentially and not concurrently. And that's sometimes an error that we do make. So how do we mitigate cognitive load? The overarching principle here is keep it simple. Too many times we get caught up in the cool things technology can do online and how we can add technology to our course. As students tell us over and over, the simple courses where they're able to navigate, find the information quickly and easily are the best for their learning. And once again, it's mitigating that load. I'm sure we've all found ourselves in situations that we're searching for something online. You know you should be able to find it quickly. You can't find it. You're going around kind of the mulberry bush. And what does that do? That increases our extraneous load so that when we do find it, we have less cognitive load there, whether it's something we want to use in our course or something learning. So really important to mitigate the load. A couple of other examples I use are chunking information. So dividing information in that way enables a student to fully understand and process one part before moving on. And that could be as simple as, you know, giving a 10 or 15-minute talk, having a prompted built-in quiz to assess student learning. As a faculty person, I can then look at the quiz very quickly and say, okay, most students had problems with question 4, so I'm going to review that before we move into the next level of learning. It really improves the transfer to long-term memory, and that's the focus. That's what we're really trying to get at. A couple others, variety. Students like change in learning within the same platform, and that's important. We were able to do some research this summer. The results are just coming in now, but preliminary, what students are telling us is that moving from a Zoom platform to a Teams platform to a collaborate platform, they're finding very difficult. What is that doing? That is increasing their extraneous load. So that certainly makes sense. And we should also think about removing non-essential content ideas. And I think that's one opportunity that has certainly come up during our pandemic right now. As we moved online, faculty met and we had to make some hard choices about what is absolutely necessary for our students to know and what's nice to know. And I think once we get through the pandemic or realize a new normal, we're going to be able to reflect back, and it's going to help all of our curriculums, because our fear in nursing has always been to keep an eye on content-heavy curriculums. And at times we, because of our personal expertise, we want to infuse everything we think they should know. We always have to go back to our entry-level competencies and to remember that they're beginning practitioners. So remove that non-essential stuff. Also, words placed close to corresponding graphics. If you're using a graphic, for example, maybe you want to show a pH balance change in the kidney and how the body compensates, then ensure the words are close to the graphic. Just with the students having to toggle between the graphic and the words, that increases the cognitive load. And lastly, there are many others, and there's lots of in the literature. Another one that I focus on is I ensure I don't narrate what's on the screen, text word for word. Because again, by doing that, I'm engaging the learner to take the information, consume the information via 2 channels rather than 1. So rather than spreading the load, they're forced to focus and process the same information twice at the same time. So repetitive learning, while has its place and is very good, concurrent repetitive learning causes an increased load and can be quite confusing. So if using narration online, and I would suggest, once again, variety, some weeks use it, some weeks not, the on-screen text is really a summary or a supplement. So just before we move into challenge-based learning cycles, if there's any questions, feel free to ask them now.
Nothing in the chat, and I don't see anybody with their hand up, Shelley.
Okay, thank you. I'm either very clear or none of this is new information.
You're very clear.
Thank you. So challenge-based learning. So challenge-based learning was, I first learned about this when I read some Bransford work in the early 2010 time. And I thought, what a great way to learn online. So the course I'm doing currently, which you can just imagine its popularity, is disaster nursing and dealing with emergencies. So we at Dalhousie University, this is an elective nursing course that we run twice a year. Our registration opens at 7 in the morning, and I believe for this session at about 7:15, I was full with 74 students. And certainly understanding we're living in a pandemic, so certainly students are drawn to what is disaster nursing all about. And we're only in week 2, and I'm already hearing from students, so that's why the province made that decision, or that's why healthcare did that. So it's really understanding what we're living through right now. So challenge-based learning draws very heavily on constructive learning theory, which is adult learning principles, basically. And discovery learning is inquiry-based. Now, there are proponents and opponents, absolutely, of discovery learning. Proponents believe that it encourages active engagement. It does promote motivation, autonomy, responsibility, independence, all of those characteristics we're looking for cultivating in our new nurses. It develops creativity, group problem-solving skills, but most of all, from my perspective, it tailors their learning experience. So it meets the students where they are, or the group of students where they are. However, critics will say that discovery learning does create a cognitive load. It may result also in potential misconceptions, and this is where the role of faculty is so very important. Teachers need to detect problems and misconceptions within those groups. So circling back to one of the hallmarks of good education is social presence. So if we engage our learners and we challenge them and we get them involved and immersed in real life situations, in my experience, they grasp it, they participate, and it becomes part of their learning. And that's what we want them to do. As a teacher, it also allows me to drop some of my prior assumptions that may have not been accurate. I think one of the most powerful statements from Bransford is, I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. And perhaps many of you can relate to this when you hear a student say, well, they didn't teach me A, B, and C. And as a faculty person that maybe taught A, B, and C, you want to say, yes, I did teach A, B, and C. And perhaps you did, but that does not mean the student learned. So I think that's the important part with these cycles, that engages the students to make the learning their own. So how did I adapt the challenge-based learning? So I contacted Dr. Bransford. His original challenge-based learning had 4 sections. So there was a challenge of some type, initial thoughts to help the students begin thinking, some resources, and final thoughts. When I wanted to translate this into nursing, I thought there's a couple real key things missing. Initial thoughts, I wanted to be the student's first reaction to the challenge, which in my situation, I'm using scenario clips. And then the think about questions I put on there was to help students pick out the salient points from the information they need. I set up a research room. So the groups of 8 students enter the research room and they decide together how to go about researching the topic so that they're able to answer the think about questions and also able to come up with the best practices for whatever the scenario clip is and how that applies to nursing. And they do that through the research room and the discussion forum, which is a back and forth over a 5-day period. In the discussion forum, 2 students each week per group are the research leaders and moderators. So they are the ones that direct the focus questions. They are the ones that provide the readings, and they're the ones that moderate the ongoing discussion. At the end of the cycle, students cycle back for final thoughts. And just to note, the initial thoughts and final thoughts are a private journal area for the students to reflect upon and think about how has their thinking changed in relation to the challenge or the scenario clip after they've discussed it with peers for the week, done some research, and looked at what best practices are. And then the ending of that are for the leaders and moderators to produce a summary of the answers, the discussion for their questions. And that's where I ensure my presence is always in those groups. I do bebop throughout those groups during the week, telling students that I'll be in there reading and will only respond or post if there's errors in any facts stated. And this gives them a sense of reassurance that I'm there. And then certainly part of the summary is an evaluative component, which I'll get to in a couple of minutes. Feedback versus feed forward. We were going to have another poll here asking folks if they've used that. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to move on and just say I use feed forward online much more than feedback. Feedback is good. We have to have it in nursing, absolutely. It focuses on the past. Where feed forward really concentrates on the future. It's not personal, but it's situational. So we're going to make those suggestions for practice. It's viewed as positive because it's solution focused rather than problem focused. Generally, students and people in general are well receive feed forward because they tend to listen more carefully and then make decisions on, is this something I will do in the future or not? It requires an in-depth understanding, certainly of the situation, but not of the person. So it takes that personal threat perhaps away, and it's viewed much more objectively. And to be honest, feed forward is much quicker and often more efficient to provide to students and from peer to peer. And if possible, it does balance the power somewhat more in learners and teachers and really trying to focus on an equal working relationship. So feed forward is much like giving suggestions for improvement rather than focusing on what happened and how that particular person can improve. Gardner's 5 minds for the future, just to give a theoretical perspective of how I try to use my CBL cycles. And that's looking at these 5 minds. We're really good at nursing with the discipline and synthesizing minds. And we're getting much better at the creative minds and ethical and respectful minds. But to remember that when we're learning with our students, it's not just about learning the knowledge, synthesizing the findings, and knowing what to do. It's about how can we be creative with what best practices are, all the while being respectful and practicing ethical care. So let's engage your 5 minds. So just imagine you're a nursing student, and we can't go through a whole cycle, but what I'd like to do now is just show you it's a 2-minute clip. It's one of the CBL cycles we'll be doing in the next few weeks, and it's the challenge in challenge-based learning. I just have to flip screens here. So this is one of the challenges. It's a couple of minutes.
As medical professionals, we have accepted that the world around us, even the way we do our jobs, has changed. Today, we have to be prepared for what a short time ago were unthinkable events. Consider the London bombings of July 2005. It's not hard at all to picture that happening here, with even more dire results. In this scenario, imagine you are a nurse in an urgent care setting. It's a typical day, some flu, some nasty-looking rashes. Suddenly, an explosion rattles the plate glass windows in the lobby and shakes the instruments and bottles on the table in front of you. It's a powerful blast. It must be close. You and your fellow nurses rush outside to see if you can find out what happened. Across the busy intersection, over at the mall, you see smoke rising and people fleeing the scene, some on foot, some running to their cars. Police, fire, and ambulances begin to arrive, but by then you see people, injured people, within a few yards of your facility. You and your fellow nurses cross the street to help them. Most are just frightened. Who wouldn't be? but several have sustained obvious injuries, the walking wounded. You spot one couple, a woman helping a man with a terrible gash in his leg. You quickly help them into a treatment room at your small facility and assess their injuries. The man has what appears to be a jagged piece of metal embedded in his thigh. The one doctor on duty that day rushes in and begins to treat the leg wound while you turn your attention to the woman. Then one of your co-workers appears in the door and motions for you to step outside. You tell your patient you'll be right back and then join your friend around the corner. On the TV, the news, she says, they say the blast, it's reading radioactive. You look at her in a moment that you will, in the future, forever recall as happening in slow motion and say, radioactive? You mean a dirty bomb? Her eyes give you your answer. Then you turn over your shoulder to the two patients in the treatment room. They could be contaminated, you think to yourself, which means you could be contaminated too. You, the doctor, the entire clinic.
Here are your challenge questions. How different do you think radiological exposure is for healthcare workers? And what personal precautions do you think are necessary? What do you know about radiation, what its sources are, and which of those may pose possible dangers? What effect does radiation have on the body? How do you provide mass casualty care in a radiological incident? How is triage different in a radiological event, if at all? Now, to record your answers, return to the Challenge Cycle menu and select Initial Thoughts.
So that is the challenge that I use within the emergency preparedness course. You can see I try to have the students do it, something short, and I think that is probably part of the important part. It's not to make the challenge so great that the student feels overwhelmed. The journals in this course are phenomenal to review with the students. So right after that clip, I asked them to record what are they thinking, what are they feeling, and then look at those questions. And those are the prompts. Those are my way of helping the students pick up the salient material in the cycle. And then we work through the cycle. So I should be back to my presentation. Are you able to see that okay?
We can see it.
Yep, it's fine.
Yeah, Shelley.
Thank you. With the initial thoughts, I get them to write down their emotions, and mostly the initial thoughts are emotional. Students, our reaction when there is something in that situation, we want to go and want to help. It's cautioning students to always assess their environment and surroundings before they move. The students then look at the different minds and see how their thinking changes or doesn't change after the whole cycle is over. So the challenge can be anything. Initial thoughts are recorded, and that's private, and it's important that students know those thoughts are private. The think about questions, as you saw, are the prompts. So that's encouraging feed forward among the group members, but also getting the student to assess their prior knowledge and hopefully at the end, their increased knowledge. The research room and discussion forum, as I said earlier, is where they work for the week. Their final thoughts have two areas. It's the weekly summary that's prepared by the leaders, as well as they revisit their initial thoughts and they assess what has changed in their thinking and why, or if nothing has changed in their thinking, why not? And this gives them an opportunity to reflect on what they've learned and to assimilate new information and maybe to disregard false information that they had in the past. You might think this is a marking nightmare, because how do we actually assess this learning? It's fairly easy, albeit it is somewhat time consuming. I do have some detailed grading matrix on the slides here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through them. However, if anybody is interested in them, I'd be more than willing to email you the copy of what I use. I do participant grading every cycle. I do 4 cycles per course. And recall, I usually have between 70 and 80 students. 5 points per cycle. And then the cycle that they're the leader and moderator, it's a 20 points. And it looks at the role and creativity as well as critical thinking, group learning, etc. Those are specifics. Once again, you can take a look at that. I won't go through them. I think one of the important parts of a good course or good evaluation for a course, once again, be it on-site or online, is that the student is fully aware of what the gold standard is. Students need to know what the expectations are and how to achieve them. Once again, you can look at these or you can email me and I'd be more than happy to share the complete grading scheme with you. The creative mind is assessed throughout the participation of group members as well as a leader. And there have been some extremely creative groups in the past. I've had some groups, you know, when learning triage, for example, doing triage videos, and I see a lot of feed forward within the discussions among the students, which is very heartwarming. This role is generally anxiety producing for students, but once we start to get into it, they start to understand that it is a huge portion of the evaluation of the course, and it also gives them appreciation for what a faculty person goes through when looking at discussion boards and how to moderate them. This role, as well with the grading rubrics, does decrease subjectivity. Some course evaluations, I usually have a very high course rating with this course. It could be the content is pretty exciting. Certainly my nursing research course doesn't give this high of quality and interest. What's key to me is the fourth one is that almost every student said it stimulated them to learn. And the cycles, waiting for each cycle, because the students don't know what disaster we're going to have next week. There was a anxiety, but also an interest in what's going to be next. So that in a nutshell is a challenge-based learning cycle. Once set up online, they're extremely rewarding as a faculty person to go through and to see the differences, because every week I have one challenge with 8 groups, and it's really interesting to see the different ways the groups go. So I just throw a challenge out there to seek that balance, nurture all the minds, because these are the minds that we're going to need caring for us as new nurses in the future, and really trying to avoid or mitigate the cognitive load in our students. When we do, we remember, and when we question, we create. And with that, I'll end the presentation and more than open to discussion, questions, etc. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Shelley. We have an opportunity for people to put some questions in the chat if you'd like. There is a sort of a question comment from Sarah. Yeah, I thought so too, Sarah. We're just wondering, I think we both had the same thoughts actually, about the size of the groups and how you manage the marking. You know, if you're thinking about undergraduate courses in particular that have a couple of hundred students, what would be the optimal size group that you would have in one of your challenge cycles?
That is a really good question, and that's one I can't answer. And if you go to the literature, it's all over the board. The majority of the literature I have searched says group size is about 5. That's not practical for me. I limit these groups to 8, and 8 I find is great. I do 4 cycles per term, which means I have 2 leaders per cycle. When I first started it, I had 1 per cycle, and 1 leader was just, they felt a bit intimidated all alone. So I've paired them up. Each group has 2 leaders each cycle, and they work together, but they have different strings or different threads. So each leader is responsible to have 1 peer-reviewed journal article related to the disaster and 2 focus questions at the level of critical thinking application, kind of way beyond knowledge comprehension, and they're graded on those as well. It can be, I do have a TA, and we split the marking. So the TA in the course, Stephanie Healy, who's been TA extraordinaire for many offerings of this course, she'll do the participant grading, and I'll do all the research leader and moderator grading, just to keep it extremely objective and systematic across the board. If you're looking for a time commitment I probably have about 20 R&L's, research leader moderators, to mark a week. So that's, once again, I only do it 4 weeks in the term because we do have that prereq knowledge, etc., that we work on. So I probably about 10 hours immersed in marking for those weeks, which I did in the summer switch up. I had my learning cycles, but I also did a final term paper. That took way much longer. And I don't think the learning was there because those were individual term papers. The strength of the learning of these cycles is in the peer interaction, or at least that's my thinking.
All right, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Other questions for Shelley? While people are thinking of questions, Shelley, and I've got the floor, have you used this cycle approach in courses other than disaster planning, or have you been able to encourage other faculty to adopt challenge cycles?
Right, no, I have used it in my nursing research course online. The challenge there for me is coming up with a challenge that entices them or brings them in. And it worked best the year I did I did small hypothetical research studies, and the challenge was for them to come up with 5 key findings in the analysis. All of the data was made up. It took a tremendous amount of time, but the key to the challenge is you have to have something that's going to engage the student. Because if the challenge is something that doesn't spark their interest or creativity, it's going to become more of a mundane task. I do have a colleague at a different university that has used this cycle in her accounting course, and that tended to work very well. Once again, courses that are open to real life experiences that you can immerse students in, you know, that to me, that is what really draws them into to grasp the cycles and to learn from each other. I think at times students are fearful that what they think they know they put on, and it could be wrong. And so the presence of the professor or the faculty online moderating from a distance, it's kind of like going back to, you know, years ago, the educator was the sage on the stage rather than the ghost in the wings. So it's being that ghost in the wings, making sure the misconceptions are cleared up if any do happen to arise. And I'll handle that very tactfully. If it's something fairly simple, I'll do it on the board. If it's more in depth, I will contact the student personally, we'll discuss it, and then the student is able to do the correction on the board. So that saves face, but it also enables them to learn and reflect upon their learning and share that with peers.
Great, thanks very much. Just actively thinking about how we might use this approach for different things. I can imagine analysis of adverse events that a student's been involved in or something would be a great opportunity.
Yes, I can even see this happening with care plans. I mean, we could take our traditional case study and put it into the cycle, but by putting it into the cycle, the onus of the learning is on the student with guidance. And that's really the premise we try at our university, is to encourage active learning.
All right, thank you. Other questions for Shelley on this very interesting topic?
And Sarah did ask about the journals, and I will say that the journals are not, the student individual journals are not graded. These are, I mean, and that could be my personal bias, because I do not believe grading self-reflection journals as right or wrong is appropriate, but that's how I approach it. So that journal with self-reflection is really for the student to see the learning that's occurred. And certainly I interact with them in those journals, but I do not grade. I do not say whether their self-reflection is right or wrong. And that's a basic premise of the way I look at self-reflection.
Thanks. Well, I'm looking at the time and I'm not seeing any other questions. So perhaps we'll close the session. Shelley, thank you for your really interesting presentation and thought-provoking presentation, and thank you to everyone who's participated and logged in today. Please note that the recording of this session will be made available on the CASN's YouTube channel, and it'll be circulated to you with a link in the coming days, and please feel free to share the link within your networks. Thank you again, everyone, and CASN certainly hopes you will consider attending future sessions in the fall, winter and spring of our Lunch and Learn series. You can seek more information regarding Lunch and Learn topics by visiting the CASN website at casn.ca. So thanks again, Shelley, really interesting, and thank you to everybody for your participation.
Thank you very much, Linda and Julia, for facilitating, and participants for coming out and listening. And yes, please do share. And if you'd like to continue dialogue or you'd like to look at those grading matrices, I'd be more than happy to share. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Shelley.
Thank you, Shelley. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Linda.
Okay.
Have a wonderful rest of day.
Okay.